Hey guys, welcome to a brand new tutorial video by WTTN. In this part 2 video, we'll be talking about creating a database, connecting to the database, fetching data, inserting data, and all the lovely stuff. So all the CRUD related operations, we'll try and take a look at it in this particular video. So in the first video, we went through the operation of creating your very own API. The first API that we created, a very basic greet message that we sent back through that API. And now what we're going to do is we are going to connect to a database and then insert some values in one table and then read those values. So with that, we'll come to know what's this entire operation like. Okay, so for connecting to a database in Spring Boot, it's fairly simple. Spring does everything for you. You don't have to do much. You just have to give it the right configuration for that database, how to connect to it. You just need to specify the what's the connection type and how you want to connect to it, and the rest Spring Boot will do on its own. Okay, so for this particular demo, what I've done is, as I mentioned in my first video as well, we are using H2 because H2 is lightweight. It'll go away with your application restarts, so it's fairly easy to clean up and all those things. So I'm keeping the default configuration here. For H2, I'm not keeping it persistent, so you can make H2 persistent as well. That means even when you do restarts, your data, whatever you have saved in the tables, it will still be there. And it's basically adding a property for a file path so that H2 can write somewhere. So we're not going to do that because it does not apply to what we're trying to demo here. Okay, so configuring your data source in Spring Boot is fairly easy. There are two ways to do it. You can do it actually multiple ways, but the two most common ways is through the application properties. You can do it through here. It will look at the properties file and try to pick up any kind of data source properties from there, or you can do it the way that I do it. I prefer to do it using YAML. So the reason I use YAML is because I feel it's more readable. So I like hierarchy. With this hierarchy structure, it's much more easier to read the properties. So I prefer YAML files over the properties files, the traditional properties file, but it's basically the same thing. With this, let's take a look at the properties that I've configured here for my H2 database. So this basically says what's the URL. So you don't have to bother about this much. You just need to make sure that your DB name is correctly configured in this particular URL. So every MySQL Oracle, everything will have its own URL. H2 has this one. Okay, so username by default is SA. Password is blank, so I've kept it blank as well. I mean, you can change it if you want to keep something else. You can change the username as well. It does not matter. JPA, you need to specify what dialect you want to use. So since we're using H2, we are going to go with the H2 dialect. This is an important step. If you don't do this, I'm not sure what happens. I think it goes into an exception because JPA is eventually it's an interface. It does not know what implementation to use when it's trying to connect with something through Hibernate. Yeah. So let's move on to the next part. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to show you the H2 console so that you guys can actually take a look at the data being inserted and then all the lovely things that we're going to do in the background. Okay, so once we are done with the configuration, right? So this is the only configuration you need to get your database connection or data source up and running in Spring Boot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a package now. So I'm going to go into a package called entities, and let's create a class or a table, which basically is going to map to a table in the H2 database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an entity. I'm calling it lead. Let's say I'm going to store some lead related information. So first let's mark it with the entity annotation. So if you want to keep it like what will happen now is Hibernate is going to take this name, right, and it's going to create a table with this particular same name. But if you don't want that to happen, you can also say that I want some different name, right? So you can give it like lead underscore data. So I can do this. So what will happen now is Hibernate will look at this particular class, and it will say, okay, I need to create a table out of this class, out of this entity, but the name has to be lead_data. You can also give it different schema. If you have different schemas, you can just give it some different schemas as well. We don't have a different schema. We are doing everything in the same one. So we're going to go forward with it. Okay, so the most important thing to do first is to give it an ID. So I'm just going to give it ID. We're to mark it. It's an ID. Now, whenever using SQL-based databases, right? So your primary key needs to be you need to auto increment it or something like that. So H2 has an auto incremented values. I'm just going to go with generated value. This is not a Hibernate session, but still I'll just talk about. So if there are different strategies that you can pick. Usually it's auto, which means that it will go to whatever is the default strategy for that database. You can also have some different strategies. If you are using sequences in Oracle or something like that, you can also specify that here. Okay, the next attribute I'll say is string. Let's keep a name. I'll keep one more string for some description, where they're coming from, something like that. So we have three values in this particular table. So what is going to happen is it's going to, as I said, it's going to take a look at this, create a table with this name, lead_data. Then it's going to just create columns with ID, name, and description. If you want to change the name of the column itself, you can do that. Similarly, you can say, hey, you know what, this name is something like lead_name, something like this. You can do this. It's gonna change it. Create a column with this lead_name as the column name, rather than using whatever is the parameter here, attribute here, sorry. So okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and remove that. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use a Lombok annotation. So I'm just going to make this #1 as data. So as I said in my first video, right, I use Lombok a lot. It makes things faster for a developer. It's easier, right? So data is nothing but it specifies that this particular class is going to be used like a DTO, like a data transfer object, throughout the application, and that's essentially what we're going to do. Ideally, what we would have done is take an entity class, have a separate DTO class, but that's not the purpose of this demo. So I'm just going to call this entity class as data. So data is going to generate the getters, setters for this. I think it also does hash codes. Let's take a look. Yeah, so it's going to go with required constructor. It's going to generate a toString equals an hash code and value. Everything it's going to do for you. You don't have to worry about it much. So yeah, so that's done. Now what I'm going to do is, since we have an entity, now let's create a repository. The next step, creating a repository. So I'm just going to create a package. I'm just going to create a class. I'm going to say lead repository. Yeah, okay. Oops, I made a mistake. So repositories should never be classes. So I'm just going to delete this one, and I'll come to, I never delete stuff, so I'm not finding delete. Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to go new lead repository, and as I said, it should never be classes. It should be interfaces, and I'm going to talk about it as to why these need to be an interface. So #1, mark it as a repository, annotate it as a repository. Now this needs to extend the JPA repository. The JPA repository we are extending because we are going to use JPA. We're going to leverage JPA. We're not going to use Hibernate directly. We're going to leverage JPA. It does everything for us. Everything is pre-built for us. We just need to pick our functions and use them, rather than actually writing implementations for them, writing queries and all those stuff, right? So this is the advantage of using JPA. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify which table or entity I'm going to use it with, and what's the primary key like. So we know primary key is of type long. The table that we're going to use, or the entity, is lead, so I'm going to use this one. Okay, so that's it. Repository is created. Now the repository is the I would say the channel through which we're going to interact with the database for this particular table or this particular entity. So what we're going to do now is, let's create a controller in our APIs called lead controller, right? As always, mark it as REST controller. And also what I'm going to do is I'm going to create separation in my functionality. So I'm just going to say lead /lead. So what this means is anything after localhost 8080 and then the root is / anything after that which says lead will essentially be using whatever APIs we define in the lead controller. So you don't have to define your lead / maybe find or lead / put. All those APIs can come under one particular controller, and it will be starting with the /lead. So that's why we mark the controller itself with request mapping. So yeah, that's fairly simple. Okay, now let's step up to public. So let's write a function which gives us a list of all leads in our database. So I'm just going to say return. Now, how do we want to interact with this? As I said, we are going to use the repository, right? So let's auto wire that here, lead repository. Now, how do we want to auto wire this? So you'll see people do this. I tend to not do this, right? So whenever you have any kind of dependency, right? So this is a mandatory dependency if you think about it, right? So our lead controller cannot work without a lead repository. So it has to be auto-wired through constructor. So that's a good practice to do. You should always auto-wire through constructor wherever possible, and never auto-wire through the attribute directly. You can do that. I mean, nobody's going to stop you. Even it's going to run even if I don't do this and I just mark this as auto-wired. But this is a mandatory dependency for lead controller, right? So that's why we should inject it through the constructor, not through the attribute. Okay, so attribute means setter. Let's do this. So as I said, right, lead repository is the point of contact for us whenever we want to interact with the lead table in the H2 database, right? So here I'm just going to use the functionality which is already present in my JPA repository, coming in from the CRUD repository, that is find all. I'm just going to use that one to fetch me a list of all the leads that are there in the particular table. Okay, so we need to annotate this with a get mapping. This one is a get, so I'm just going to say let's keep it like the root. So anything after lead and then a blank means we need everything. I'm just going to leave it at that. Now I'm also going to put in a put mapping, right? So put mapping is used whenever we want to invoke the put, right? So for our inserts, right? For our inserts, I'm going to use a put rather than a get or a post. We can't use a get, but rather than a post, I would rather use the put, because that's more logical, right? So I'm just going to do string. We can do a boolean, right? Yeah, let's do a boolean for now. I'm just going to say insert lead, and I'm going to pass this a lead entity. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to use the lead repository, and I'm just going to save it, and I'm going to give it lead, and I'm going to return true. Right, I could have kept this as void, it's fine, but it's a good I would say it's a good mechanism where you're returning something, a string or something. Ideally it should be a string which says successful, not successful. If there's an error, what's the error, and the error should flow through something else, not through here. We'll talk about it in a different video altogether. So as I said, we need to put something, that is insert something, right? And then we get to our actual listing of it. So now we have inserted something. So I'm just going to run this first, and let's go to our H2 console and check out what's happening there. Let's go to the YAML, take this. Yeah, so as you can see, it's up and running, and it will give you a log which says where the H2 console is being, what's the root of H2 console. So it says H2 console, right? So I have it open here, so I'm just going to go, yep, so localhost 8080, and you see the H2 console. Now there will be some JDBC default URL here, right? So just, that's what I was pulling up. You just need to put in whatever you have added. So it was my DB by default. I changed it to test DB, right? So just test your connection, everything works. There's no password by default, so connect. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if my table is created. So I'm going to run the table, and as you can see, right, as I told you, right, Hibernate did not create it with lead, it created with lead underscore data, as I had mentioned. So I need to do this. So yeah, the table is created, everything seems to be working fine. So now what we'll do is let's add a record in this through the API, through our put, and then we'll do a get on the root of lead, and we'll check if we are getting some data. So I'm just going to hop over to Postman, start a new tab. I'm just going to change this to put. The type is put because we are doing an insert. Oops, it's not HTTPS. I had something going on. Localhost 8080/leads, and then I'm gonna say insert. In my body, right, I'm just gonna go raw. Let's do JSON. I think that's easier for everybody to understand. So I'm just gonna say ID. I'm not gonna pass the ID, right? So I'm just gonna give name. Let's give test, and description. I'm gonna say DESC. So I'm just gonna send this data, and it says true. Let's go over into our H2 console. I'm gonna run this query again. So yeah, I see that it's inserted some data. It didn't take the data that I had sent, description and name. So I'm just going to check like what's the problem. So I think it's not taking my body because yes, I made that mistake. I should not have passed it from the body. I should have passed it from here. So I'm just going to say test, and value is going to be DESC. Description is DESC. I'm going to send again. It says true. Run it, and yep, as you can see, it's getting us the test named and the description. So yeah, so I by nature I passed everything in the body, but we're not using the body right now. We are in the parameters yet. So this makes more sense, right? So what is happening essentially is when you're passing these parameters, right, it's being bundled as you can see here, right? It's going like this as query parameters, right? And what is happening internally is it's automatically converting it into the entity class that we have defined. So this happens by default in a Spring Boot application, and we don't have to worry about the conversion of this. Otherwise we would have to write manually the mappings for each and every attribute that we are passing here. But yeah, so this happens automatically, sorry, so we don't have to worry about it. So now what we'll do is we'll open one more tab. I'm just going to copy paste this, and I'm going to open one more tab, and I'm going to keep it at get, and I'm just going to pass the root, that is lead, with a slash, and I'm going to send, and yes, you can see that we are getting the data that we wanted over here, right? That looks good. Okay, so let's try one more final thing. Let's try to update this 2, right? So let's make it description 1. So all I'm going to do is I'm also going to pass the ID attribute now. So I'm going to run a ID, and I'm gonna say 2, and this one I'm gonna say description 1. Let's see if it updates. So I'm gonna come here, get, and yep, it did update. So essentially it's doing your inserts, it's doing your updates as well. So ideally, right, ideally what we would do is we would have an endpoint which basically is enabling us for your updates and your inserts. So we would name it in a functional order, right? So whatever is the functional requirement for that put, we would name it over here, and this would be the lead here in this case is the entity. So that's how we should structure our URL so that it's easier for everybody to read, and we try to maintain a standard there. But yeah, I think similarly for delete, we just need to write one more endpoint, which is going to take in the taking the ID, and we're just going to delete it using the JPA Repository interface that we had created. So I think, yeah, that's about it. As you saw, it's like fairly simple, fairly easy to do, easy to configure, and easy to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this into a Git repo of mine, and I'm going to link that in the description, so you can pull this up and you can play around with it yourself directly. Just follow along with the video. So thank you for watching, guys, and have a great day ahead.